Hillbrook Insane Asylum Patient File Update. Entry by Dr. Quinton Quatermain. Patient number 155, Guy Smith, aka Henchman. They were going to call him Minion, but there was apparently some kind of trademarking issue there. I've been trying a number of new therapies with patient number 155 in an attempt to broaden his sense of self. Talking therapy has proven inadequate. However, I've recently developed a variation on cognitive behavioural techniques, which I think shows a lot of promise. In our most recent session, I tried getting him to come up with a haiku, both as a mental exercise as well as a way for him to put his feelings into words. The results were interesting. Doctor asks me to create a short 3-sentence poem. The task is confusing and challenging to me. And yet, just like that, it is complete. I know it doesn't seem like much, but I assure you, getting this level of introspection out of him is quite the accomplishment. See, patient number 155 has a truly unique psychosis. A strange sort of combination of emotional detachment and identity disorder. The patient is completely lacking in... well, how to describe this? Okay, let me explain. If you ask patient number 155 to do something, he will do it. No questions asked, no hesitation, no contemplation. He'll just immediately do whatever it is you asked of him, exactly as you asked him to do it. Outside of this, he will do nothing. And I mean nothing. He doesn't talk, he doesn't move, he doesn't eat, he doesn't even sleep. He will just stand there in his cell, completely still, awaiting his next task. Like a TV on standby. It's hauntingly fascinating that a human being can reach this state. It's bizarre. On the bright side, this means he's fairly low maintenance. So long as you're careful with your words when around him, he's completely harmless. That said, he is not ready to rejoin society. Not by a long shot. For as his tale will tell you, absolute compliance can be a very dangerous thing. Saturday night, deep in the city. 3 men shambled their way out of a bar, each heavily intoxicated, but none quite as badly as one Reggie Pierce. Alcohol, what had once been his greatest vice, was now his only escape, his only means to forget. Reggie had recently seen the collapse of his 8-year-long marriage with his wife Linda, and not long after that, had lost custody of his 2 sons, Mark and Jerry. This had served to aggravate his alcoholism further, ironically what had initially caused him and Linda to start drifting apart in the first place. Now, he only had his old college buddies, Mike and Oscar, to support him. Figuratively and literally in this case, as the 2 carried him out into the street. Mike continued his drunken singing, whilst Oscar, the one amongst the 3 who was closest to being sober, tried to hail down a taxi. Rain was coming in hard, and none of them wanted to be out in it any longer than they had to be. The road was packed though, traffic nearing a complete standstill. But eventually, a little yellow cab made it through, slightly cutting off a larger estate car as it pulled up. The 3 thought nothing of it, stepping into the back seat and shaking off as much water as they could. The driver gave the typical welcome and asked where they wanted to go. Oscar gave him directions to his and Mike's apartment, where the 3 had been staying ever since Linda kicked Reggie out of the house, who was done with the jolly stage of being inebriated and had moved on to the melancholy stage, eliciting a groan out of his 2 friends as they knew precisely what was coming next. Another ballad of how much his life sucked now, and that he'd never love again, and all the usual self-pitying crap they'd grown accustomed to. It was was rather hard to remain sympathetic when it's all he would talk about. About 2 minutes in, having listened to Reggie drone on and on, a fed-up Mike shouted for him to stop already. They were then all suddenly jolted forward as the taxi came to a complete stop. After nearly being choked out by his own seatbelt, Oscar called to the driver, asking what had happened. The driver simply replied that they had stopped. Perplexed further, Oscar asked why, and the driver, indicating towards Mike, said he told him to. Realizing the cause of the confusion, Oscar explained that Mike was actually talking to Reggie, not him, and it was all a misunderstanding. With that cleared up, everyone sat back in their seats and waited to get underway. And continued to wait. And wait. And wait. By now, a rather lengthy queue had formed behind the taxi, soon breaking out into a barrage of horns and angry yells. This did away with what little remained of Mike's previously chipper attitude as he barked at the driver to get them moving. He obliged, and they were soon on their way. Oscar was willing to drop it, but Mike, still annoyed and eager to vent, looked about for this cabbie's information in hopes of giving him a bad review later. He soon found his card fitted to the back of his seat and began laughing hysterically when he saw his name. Guy Jonathan Smith. Had to be the most nondescript name ever given. Not that there was much to describe. Average height and build, no distinguishing marks, standard cab driver uniform. The most noteworthy thing about this guy, it seemed, was just how amazingly unnoteworthy he was. The judgment of others clearly meant little to him, however, nonchalantly driving and never looking back, regardless of the insults thrown at him. Then Reggie spoke up, asking Guy if he'd ever been in love. No, Guy answered, as he put the windscreen wipers up to their highest setting, the torrential downpour continuing to worsen. Regardless of his evident disinterest in the question, the subject matter, and conversation in general, Reggie began to tell Guy all about his love life. How he missed the warmness of Linda's touch, how he'd failed as a provider, and how he wished that he could just spend one more day with his boys. Luckily, Mike interrupted him yet again, having spotted a fast food joint and insisting they get drive-through. Before anyone could say anything more, Guy had already driven up to the window. Shrugging that they were there now, they may as well get something to eat, the three placed their orders. In his sudden case of the munchies, however, Mike had completely forgotten that he was broke. After both Oscar and Reggie refused to lend him money, he yelled at Guy to give him some. When Guy asked how much, he said, "As much as you have." So Guy proceeded to throw his credit card at him, and then told him his PIN number. Up until this point, the friends had considered their driver a little odd, but nothing to be concerned about. This, however, was when they realised something was up. Driving into a nearby car park, as per their instructions, the three began to, for lack of a better word, experiment with Mr. Smith. Seeing him blindly acquiesce with each and every one of their requests, everything from slap yourself to do the Macarena, it became abundantly clear what was up. This man would, for whatever reason, do whatever they asked of him. While the insufferable Mike was back to laughing his arse off, a curious Oscar asked why he was doing this. Guy simply said, "I'm a good boy. I do as I'm told." Obviously now, the smart, considerate thing to do in a situation like this is inform the proper authorities, apprise them to what you've learned, and see to it that this clearly unwell human being gets the proper treatment and help that he needs before he inadvertently hurts himself or others. Unfortunately, with this being a Hillbrook Asylum story and not an It Gets Better story, Mr. Smith was not in the company of smart, considerate people. Once they got to the apartment, before Guy could get back out on the road, Mike told him to leave the car and come with them. Unlike Guy, Oscar objected, but Mike insisted that they were just going to hang out for a bit, show him some proper gratitude, then he'd let him be on his way. Of course, that's not what happened. For when you've lived your life on the bottom, like Mike here, you tend to develop a keen eye for opportunity, and a far greater inability to let it go once you've found it. Over the next couple of weeks, Guy pretty much acted as a personal servant to Mike, and to a lesser extent Reggie. The two had him perform menial tasks around the apartment: cleaning, cooking, taking out the garbage. One might have called him a butler, but even butlers are given more decency and respect than this man was getting. Despite practically moving in with them, Guy was given neither time to eat nor a place to sleep. Not that he actually did either of these things without being told to. The only one who would was Oscar, and that could only happen when he wasn't at work. Unlike his friend, a term he was using to describe Mike with less and less frequency, Oscar was very much against taking advantage of this man's condition. He would often talk to Guy, try and find out more about him, or how he got this way, perhaps figure out some way of helping him. However, all his attempts were unsuccessful, either due to Mr. Smith's incredible disinterest in himself, or sabotaged by the chronically unemployed Mike and Reggie, who all the while lazed about at home, the former helping himself to Guy's impressive savings, while the latter merely used it as an excuse to wallow in self-pity even more. At this point, there wasn't a waking moment when the man wasn't completely plastered. One night, Reggie was laid out on his bed, staring at his wedding ring, a family heirloom that had been passed down for several generations. Linda never did give back the other ring, a fact that nagged at him each and every day. The mere thought causing him to cringe in sadness, Reggie yelled for another beer, and was promptly given one by Guy, who despite his situation seemed no less content than when he was driving his taxi. As it happens, his employer had tried contacting him several times, but with Mike having claimed Guy's phone, no calls managed to reach him. Couldn't risk losing his new manservant after all. Cracking open the can, its frothy contents pouring down his hand, Reggie heard the door to the apartment open. Oscar must have been back from the office, and sure enough, his angered voice could soon be heard coming from the other room. He and Mike were arguing over something, soon yelling for Guy to come and join them. Reggie didn't care, chugging down his drink as his eyesight began to blur, a haze overcoming his senses. After hearing Oscar shout something he couldn't quite make out, he passed out altogether. Coming around several hours later, he was glad to hear the commotion had ended. Or at least he would have been if he hadn't been distracted with the mother of all hangovers. Shambling out into the living room and briefly tripping on something, Reggie made it to the bathroom. A good 10 minutes of vomiting and fruitlessly searching for aspirin later, he was finally able to see again. At which point, he noticed something on his right ankle. A red stain. At first, he thought he might have cut himself by accident, but upon closer inspection, found no wound. This blood wasn't his. With the door left ajar, he heard a faint noise coming from the living room. a sort of hushed rambling. Heading inside, he found the source to be Mike, curled up in the fetal position over in the corner, his face adorned with an expression of complete shock. In the centre of the room, standing perfectly still and looking about as indifferent as ever, was Guy. Laid out on the now increasingly red-coloured carpet beneath him was Oscar. It took a full minute for what Reggie was looking at to properly register. When it finally dawned on him that this wasn't some drunken hallucination, he damn near screamed. What the hell had happened here? He had to ask the question 2 more times before Mike found it in himself to answer. He said they were just talking. Oscar was complaining about their treatment of Guy again, saying it was wrong for them to use another human being like this. Mike argued that they weren't doing anything wrong. Guy had done all of this willingly. He wasn't forcing him or anything, so what did it matter? Oscar said that was rubbish. He's clearly unwell and needs proper help, and he's not going to stand for this anymore because blah blah blah, the usual crap he'd heard plenty of times already. Tired of having this discussion, Mike yelled at Guy, who they'd called in earlier, to just get rid of him already. So Guy went into the kitchen, pulled out a knife, and slit Oscar's throat, thus getting rid of him. The two began to panic until Reggie had a moment of clarity. They weren't responsible for the murder, Guy was. All they had to do was explain that to the police. And also explain how they'd unlawfully kept a mentally ill human being as a slave. And how one of them had indirectly caused said murder. Yeah, that clearly wasn't an option. Mike disagreed. Guy did everything you asked of him, remember? They just had to order him not to tell anyone about their involvement in all this. Reggie put this idea to the test. Guy, he asked, did we keep you here as our own personal slave? No. Did you just lie to me? Yes. See, this isn't going to work, Mike! There was no way out of this that involved admitting anything to the police. None that didn't end with them going to prison, at least. And Mike, an ex-con, wasn't eager to return. Doing their best to remember the last crime drama they'd watched together, they rolled up the carpet with Oscar's corpse inside. There was a secluded wood just a couple miles out of town. All they had to do was get there, bury the body, and refrain from ever talking about this ever again for the rest of their lives. First though, they needed to get it to the ground floor. With the lift to their apartment complex being eternally out of order, the three were forced to take the stairs. It goes without saying, but being covert whilst carrying an extra large carpet isn't easy. Still, they had picked a good time for it. The dead of night, around the time most would be in bed and even the latest of late night parties would be dying down. Something they hadn't accounted for, however, was just how committed their landlady, Martha Cook, was to her nighttime bike riding. They made it to the 2nd floor when they ran into her. Luckily, she had met Guy before, leaving all suspicion to fall squarely on the rolled-up carpet. A suspicion that only grew stronger when she noticed a red substance beginning to drip out of the bottom. Reggie came over all flustered. Put on the spot, he quickly spouted out that they'd been cooking, spilled some marinara sauce on the rug, and it had stained, and seeing as how he was getting kinda tatty anyway, they were just gonna take it down the tip. Plausible explanation, though Martha found it strange they were doing it so late at night. Reggie told her he could say the same about her bike riding. Unable to refute that, she shrugged and carried on her way, wishing them all a good night. Breathing a sigh of relief, Reggie continued to lead the three of them out into the car park. He and his friends didn't actually own a car, so they would have to use Guy's taxi to transport the body. But as they stuffed it into the trunk, Mike seemed distracted. When Reggie asked what was wrong, he simply answered, "We have to kill Martha." Reggie was shocked by this. They already had one death on their hands, now he wanted another one? He argued it was fine, they had convinced her. Besides, if they got caught now, the worst they'd be charged with was manslaughter and slavery. This would be straight up murder. But Mike said they couldn't risk it. The minute word got out about Oscar mysteriously disappearing, she'd immediately know what was up. Get her out of the picture, bury the bodies, hide out in Mexico till it all blows over. Reggie couldn't believe what he was hearing. He knew Mike had had some trouble with the law before, some minor theft and a bit of carjacking back in his more youthful days. This, though, was an all-new side of him. And Reggie wasn't liking it all that much. He would have discussed the matter further, however, he then noticed that Guy was no longer with them. Shortly after this discovery, both he and Mike heard an ear-piercing scream coming from Martha Cook's apartment, from which Guy would soon exit. Asked what he had done, he replied in that unchanging, monotone voice of his that he was doing what he was told to. She was now out of the picture, he'd found some shovels to bury the body with, and he'd even managed to get his hands on a travel map that included the fastest route to Mexico. Say what you like, the man's efficient if nothing else. As the many windows of the apartment complex began to light up, it became evident that they couldn't stick around much longer. With no time to clear up whatever new mess Guy had made inside, the three piled into his taxi. While Mike originally made a dive for the wheel, Guy got into the driver's seat first. It was almost like a pre-programmed sequence. Once he was sat down, he immediately re-entered the taxi driver routine he'd been doing when they first met, asking them where they wanted to go and even putting the meter on. Obviously, unlike myself, neither Reggie nor Mike cared about the intricacies of how Mr. Smith's psychosis functioned, as they shouted for him to get them away from here as quickly as possible, which, sure enough, he did. Though Guy had little issue driving at high speed, quite impressively avoiding any and all collisions along the way, he still attracted the unwanted attention of a police cruiser that began pursuing, leading into a thrilling chase through the city streets. Or at least, what would have been a thrilling chase if it weren't for Guy stopping the car every time the police officer with the megaphone instructed him to. Only to immediately be told by Mike to speed up again, essentially stop starting all the way up the road. It was genuinely the most awkward looking police chase ever caught on camera. Eventually, Reggie resorted to covering his ears in order to keep them moving. Amazingly, this tactic worked, and they managed to lose their pursuers, getting out of their sight before pulling into an alleyway. Stepping out for some air, Mike said they'd wait here for it to all die down a bit before getting the plan back on track. Reggie, though, failed to see much point in it, not after what happened with Martha. He inquired if Guy had at the very least made an attempt to hide her body, to which he answered with confusion. Yeah, funny thing, he hadn't actually killed Martha. Like he said, he had done what he was told to do, take her out of the picture. So he went into her apartment, looked for the nearest photo with her in it, and tore her out of it. Aside from giving Martha a bit of a fright, she was completely unharmed. Upon realizing that the police had only wanted to pull them over for speeding, and that by fleeing the scene they had in fact incriminated themselves further, and made it so the authorities now had their vehicle's license plate on record, essentially screwing up any chances they had of getting out of the state unnoticed, Mike kind of lost it, screaming out to the heavens in frustration. As for the others, Guy just stared blankly as ever, and Reggie looked about ready to give up altogether. This was it, he thought. He was going to prison and would never get a chance to make it up to his boys. That's when he realized something. The boys. They lived just a couple miles away at their mother's house. She had a car. He'd been there a couple times. And knew where she kept her keys. Catching on to what he was thinking, Mike calmed down. It was a long shot to be sure, but switching cars could help throw up suspicion long enough for them to get some distance between them and the cops. But then Reggie revealed his other motivation for doing this, namely, get Mark and Jerry back. To him, there was no way he could just move on without them. Their escape to Mexico could be a new start, a chance at a do-over, a chance to be the father they deserved. Mike did not share his enthusiasm, however. This night had already gotten out of hand. Adding a kidnapping in there wasn't going to help. He just wanted to get the car and go. This, predictably, descended into another argument, and when it became clear Mike wasn't going to win it, he resorted to his usual tactic, taking the ball and going home. He snatched Guy's keys and made for the taxi. Except the moment he did this, something amazing happened. Without being instructed to, without so much as a word being said to him, Guy shot forward, kneed him in the stomach before repeatedly slamming the driver's side door down on his neck. Reggie called out for him to stop, but it was already too late. Mike was gone, his windpipe crushed to pieces. "He was trying to steal the taxi," Guy mumbled. "Must not let anyone steal the taxi." Shoving a dead friend into a car boot for the second time that night, Reggie began to really contemplate the depths of Guy's psychosis. What he had just seen was proof that Guy could perform, or at least repeat actions, without being told to, so long as they were made adamant enough. Whoever his employer had been must have gotten him into some sort of continuous behavioural loop, one he was trying to get back into now that he was in an environment that had been designated for that action, namely the taxi. With this in mind, Reggie considered that, with the right conditioning, he might be able to get Guy to keep quiet about all this after all. Maybe even take the fall for it. But that would have to wait. Right now, he had to focus on getting out of this mess. And with no one left to object, he set course for Linda's house. The trip there was uneventful, aside from that one instance when Reggie had to prevent Guy from picking up a potential passenger. Again, full taxi mode at the moment. When they pulled up outside the house, he decided that, given Guy's track record, he might be best to take some precautions. So, he took him to one side, looked him dead in the eye, and laid it all out for him. No matter what happened, no harm was to come to either Mark or Jerry. Their safety was to be his top priority, and if anything bad would have happened to them, he had to stop it, no matter the costs. With parameters set, they made their way inside. Guy, it turned out, being quite handy when it came to lockpicking. Made Reggie wonder who else this bizarre man had fallen into the employ of previously. Mark and Jerry slept soundly in their shared bedroom, both blissfully unaware of the chaos that had taken place that night. But whatever innocent, boyish dreams the two were enjoying would be unfortunately cut short, as they were suddenly awoken by, of all people, their father. They were happy to see him, and yet puzzled at the same time. Mum said he wasn't to be around them anymore. They had never quite understood what the divorce had all been about, which would make things all the easier for Reggie. He assured them that it was fine, he and their mother had talked it out, and they were allowed to spend time together again. And the reason he'd woken them up so early was because they were going on a big trip, an extended vacation of sorts. That certainly got them excited. So much so that they almost completely ignored the strange man that was with him. Reggie introduced Guy, saying he was a friend catching a lift with them. He'd be on his way once they reached their destination. Not a total lie, it seems, then. Mark and Jerry followed Guy out to the car, Reggie saying that he had to get a few things before they left. Creeping into his ex-wife's bedroom, he saw her asleep, looking annoyingly content with having the double-sized bed all to herself now. Linda was always the cautious type, insisted keys be kept in the bedside drawer, far away from the front door where thieves could get at them. Fat lot of good that ended up doing her. Reggie found the keys to the family car easy enough, but during his search, he found something else he'd been wanting to get his hands on. His ex-wife's ring. It sat there in a little box at the far back. Rather touching she decided to keep it in such a manner. Almost enough to stop him from taking it. Almost. But then, just as he was picking it up, a couple of screams came from outside. Being kids, Mark and Jerry had gotten bored in the very few minutes they'd been waiting, and had gotten curious about the taxi sitting in their driveway. With Guy doing nothing to dissuade them, they opened up the trunk and, well, were met with a rather nasty surprise. To make matters worse, their screams of terror had woken up Linda, who, due to the room's poor lighting, couldn't quite make out her ex-husband's face. All she saw was some intruder going through her personal belongings, and from there, she pretty much let her self-defense lessons take the wheel. Again, the cautious type. Reggie had been looking out the window at the time, so was unprepared for when Linda suddenly attacked from behind. He tried to explain it was him, but she wasn't listening. Then again, even if he had managed to get a word in, explaining that her ex-husband had broken into her home to steal their children wasn't exactly going to defuse the situation anyway. So when he did get a moment of leverage, he instead called out for help, and Guy promptly burst into the room to provide it. Well, as best a man with his condition could. Fending Guy off isn't exactly difficult when all you have to do is tell him to get lost. The only thing stopping him from leaving the room every time Linda shouted for him to do so was Reggie constantly in turn telling him not to. It felt less like a climatic fight and more like two people squabbling over an Alexa. After about the third or fourth time Guy had gone to pull Linda off of Reggie, only to let go as per her request, Reggie had had enough. Making his voice as loud as possible, drowning out any other sounds, he ordered for Guy to get her off of him, ignore everything else. Guy grabbed Linda from behind. She protested just as she had done before, but this time it had no effect. He lifted her up as she struggled against his grip to no avail. As Reggie got to his feet, he looked up just in time to see him hurl her away, one last scream escaping her lips, before her head made impact with the corner of the window ledge. In that moment, all feelings of anger and resentment disappeared from Reggie's mind. He ran to Linda's side, but it was already too late. He began to cry, weeping as he looked upon what his actions had wrought. For a moment, he glared up at Guy, throwing a meek excuse for a punch his way, missing by a few inches. He wanted to be angry at him, to throw all the blame his way, but one look at that glassy, empty stare of his, and all he saw was a soulless machine. A tool used for the selfish gain of others. While he had done the deed, it was by the command of someone else. Well, no more, Reggie vowed. He was done. He just wanted to leave and get this, the worst day of his entire life, over with. Laying Linda's body down, he went outside to join his still distraught sons. They bombarded him with questions. Why were there dead people in the back? Who was this man with him? Where was their mother? Reggie didn't want to hear it, telling them to get in the car. They continued to pester him regardless, refusing to budge. Jerry in particular wanted his mum, in serious need of some comforting. His father was at his wit's end, grabbing him by the arm, trying to force him into the vehicle. Mark yelled for him to stop, that he was hurting him. Reggie was then immediately decked by a strike from behind. Laid out on the drive, he looked up to see his attacker, Guy. Retribution for that earlier strike? No. Guy was incapable of such malice. And when Reggie told him to stop, he proved incapable of that too. As instructed by his last command, ignore everything else. Therefore, all he had to work off of was whatever programming he'd last been given. The boys had been harmed. He had to stop that. So, regardless of their protests, he continued, ramming his foot down upon Reggie's head. Mark and Jerry could do nothing. Nothing but stand there and watch as this stranger beat their father to death. Ironically, Miss Cook never did end up calling the police. The grim scene was instead found the following morning by a patrol car. The best they could describe Guy's condition upon discovery was catatonic, except he was still awake, fully conscious and aware of what he was doing, namely, nothing, which he continued to do all throughout his arrest, the investigation, and his sectioning. After a reported 4 days without sleeping or eating, he collapsed, regaining consciousness a couple days later. Keeping with his computer-like behaviour, this seemed to act as a sort of reboot for him. All previous commands were wiped, and he was back to taking orders left and right from anyone and everyone. Despite this, he is still yet to follow through on my request of explaining how he got this way. Whether he is unwilling or unable to tell me is still up for debate. I did manage to track down the taxi company he worked for, but apparently he'd only been employed there a short while, so there really wasn't much to dig up there. I'm making it a point to look into this further, as I suspect his psychosis might be linked to some kind of childhood trauma. A form of madness so completely compromising such as this had to have been manifested, or at the very least triggered, back when the brain was still developing. Speaking of which, I'm told the 2 boys that were caught up in all this are still in therapy, though their caretakers say they're optimistic. They hope to put them up for foster care by the end of the year. Guy Smith, on the other hand, is likely going to be remaining with us for quite a lot longer. Enrico... Oh, hang on. Hello? Whoa, slow down. What is it? What's wrong? Well, yeah, that's why I sent them to you. What? Wait, what? Yeah, I'm gonna have to call you back. Oh, hell. Huh? Oh, right. End recording.